So welcome everyone to the next episode of the Catributors podcast. We have a returning guest, Aerroon, who has obviously the most amazing nickname. Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Hello guys, I'm Aerroon. I make videos for World of Warships on YouTube, sometimes. And I have to agree with Atem. His nickname is really, really good. Like, it's basically perfection, especially the start of it.
Definitely.
I'm feeling left out here now.
Well,
Hello,
you should have
I'm
picked a better name.
PointyHairedJedi.
I mean, sure.
Doesn't quite flow, does it? Oh well.
Well,
So, not a lot of devlog news to talk about this week.
but there are the Christmas or New Year event rewards have been revealed in a way. So you get a New Year certificate for tier 10s that you can then turn in for a gift container. And considering that this year we are going to have actual drop rates, you can even decide which container is more worth it. So it's gonna be interesting.
Wait, can you be more specific? So you mean that for Christmas or New Year, the celebration is going to be what exactly?
You have snowflakes again, and when you play a tier 10 ship, you get one New Year's certificate, and one certificate gets you a small Santa box, and 3 get you a big Santa box, and 5 get you a mega Santa box.
I see.
I'm sure there'll be lots of people crunching the numbers once we do know the odds for the boxes of what the best sort of value for money is in terms of, well, value for certificates is in terms of whether you save them or spend them on the lower value ones.
And
What
then
do the lower tier ships get?
tier 8 to tier 9 get steel, and tier 5 to tier 7 get coal.
Wow, steel. Wow.
Yeah, tier 8 and tier 9, 75 steel each.
They have, I think they did this definitely last year, and I can't remember if it was the year before. It's the certificate thing that's new here, really. Which, I mean, it's just another temporary currency at the end of the day with a slightly different name. But the fact that you can use it to get the containers is
See,
nice.
if Wargaming were smarter, they would have named it 2021 or 2022 New Year certificate. That way they could just recycle it next year.
Well, but then they would have to rename it next. They can use the exact same thing again.
Yeah, but then people are going to be upset that, hey, my New Year certificate this year, last year it gave me 1 Santa box for 5. Now this year it gives me 1 for 6. What's going on?
Inflation. Just call it inflation.
It's a bit less sort of useful is the right word, but it's a bit less nice than the super containers we had for the birthday event. Because the Santa containers, I mean, they've got their own mix of, like, if I remember correctly, ships and flags and camos and things. So
true, but we don't know the odds of a ship in a super container, right?
Yeah, that's true. We kind of, like, a big question mark over all of this is what are the odds? How do we compare these two things? So we'll see.
I got really lucky with my super containers this year. I got like an obscene amount of doubloons and all kinds of other stuff that you normally shouldn't get.
I think I got steel out of one, and the others were fairly disappointing.
That was my first ever steel super container in I don't know how many years playing this game. Was this year from the birthday event. Never got one before. They are so rare.
I actually have the file accidentally open. I got 6,000 steel, that's 4 steel containers, 80 days of premium, 14,000 doubloons, and 75,000 coal. And then obviously other stuff too.
How many did you open?
I don't know how many tier 10 ships are there, -1. So 50 something.
Okay. But it's still a pretty good haul there.
that was ridiculously lucky compared to what I saw from everyone else.
Well, I mean, the luck had to go somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I stole it from all of you. I'm really glad for the premium days, though, because now it'll only take me. Wow, the maths is too hard. I have 1,590 days of premium.
See, I only have 600 something. Now I feel like a pleb.
Wow, that's only 2 years.
So there are some other blogs, but it's all test ship changes, pretty much. I don't know if there's anything really interesting in any of these.
I mean, and the test ship changes are for these super ships on like PTS.
Yeah, some of them are. There's one for a couple of the Pan-Asian cruisers to do with their ballistics, which doesn't mean anything to anybody because none of us know to play them. So, and yeah, mostly it is of the super ships and a couple of other things as well. Like Repulse has gone up in its reload slightly and stuff like that. So,
And the torpedo switch time for the new submarines with the double torpedoes have been adjusted, which is interesting because they haven't really started testing them yet, or at least not anywhere where the public could see them. So they're already making changes to the changes that are not live.
I do want to mention the test ships, the super ships. For those who don't know, they're the new super ships. Obviously, you've seen and heard of the Hanova and the I forgot what the Japanese one was, but that's irrelevant. That one doesn't matter. It's all about the Hanova. But there's also cruisers that have something called an autoloader, where effectively they fire, in the case of the destroyer, 4 salvos, in the case of the Condé, 3 salvos, or in the case of the Annapolis, 2 salvos when you use it, and then the guns go on a really long reload. So effectively, you fire 3 salvos almost immediately. And the Condé, in this sense, was really incredibly powerful. Basically, think of an Henri that just fires, I think it was 12 shells per salvo, and then it fires 3 salvos at once, so 36 Henri shells basically at the same time. And people thought that was really, 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 really powerful. OP as hell, effectively. So, test ship changes. Main battery reload time for the Condé increased from 14.5 seconds to 15 seconds. I'm sure that's gonna make a difference.
Although, didn't they change the autoloader already too in an earlier dev blog?
How much did they change it? Oh, they did, yeah.
Yeah, they changed the burst from 3 to 2.
Oh, that's actually a pretty massive change and possibly makes it not worthwhile to use.
Hmm.
But I suppose we'll have to see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, the super ships would probably need a lot of until they are ready. Also, it's always a little bit questionable if they wanna put so much into burst. Like the autoloaders, obviously, that you can really burst someone. Then the Japanese battleship has this immense dispersion buff on demand that it can really snipe someone. It's I don't know. I feel like you probably shouldn't balance things about how can we make it different ways to one-shot targets.
Perhaps, but on the other hand, you kind of need something crazy like that to make the ships super. Otherwise, remember when we actually had the super ships in battles? When we only had the 2 battleships? They were basically just destroyer and cruiser food, because fire and floodings, because they deal percentage damage, they're exactly as effective against super ships as they are against regular ships.
Yeah, your dot damage doesn't care about how many hit points you have because it's all percentage based.
True, but I mean,
and they're also bigger.
Also true, but in the end of the day, they are just basically like a Hanova is just a tier 11 Kurfürst, right? If you basically expanded the tech tree, there was nothing special except for the secondary buff, right? That could trigger. It was basically just a tier 11 Kurfürst.
Yep.
Now for the additional super ships, they went a bit more crazy. They were like, okay, if we really wanna do super, then we can basically be creative.
Yeah, but then they're also cruisers. So even if you're a super ship, you're a tier 11 cruiser. But if you come up against, I don't know, a Georgia, and Georgia gets lucky, you're still dead.
True. Unless they give the super cruisers 32mm plating. I haven't actually looked at them.
Actually, no, they didn't at the time, at least.
I mean, that would make too much sense, right?
I think it would be too powerful, though. Like, compared to... I mean, it's still a cruiser. It's supposed to die to the battleship. But you know what super ships I want to see? I want to see, like, a 1950s refit of the Midway.
You super carrier. You're just gonna go super toxic real quick there.
Yes. Well, I mean, it could be worse.
It could be a super submarine.
Yes, it could be super submarines.
I mean, the ones we have in game practically act like Cold War subs already in a lot of ways. So,
well, I don't know. Mine can't launch tridents yet. Can yours?
Yet.
Give them a month or so.
Oh, what was the really fast Soviet one, the Alpha class that could go like 40 knots or something? It was something mad like that. Nuclear, of course.
I lack the knowledge there.
It is actually called the Alpha class. And it goes 12 knots when surfaced, and 41 knots when submerged.
Yep. There you go. But that'll be the Soviet tier 10 submarine, probably.
Slap on a speed flag and a little bit of a speed boost, and we're running down Marceau soon.
Yeah, you'll be chasing
underwater
down destroyers.
The sad part is I would not even be surprised if Wargaming does something like that. But this led us nicely to the topic of submarines. Now, Wargaming is approaching this whole thing a little bit backwards because they had 2 weeks of submarine testing. Then they announced massive changes to submarines. Then instead of implementing those changes, they kept testing the old version of submarines that are obsolete, where the test data is pointless. Then they made a survey about the obsolete submarines, right, for people to give their opinion on something that's no longer relevant. And now they keep testing the no longer relevant submarines, and then at some point they'll do the changes and shred all the data they've collected since then because it's pointless. And, I mean, basically, I don't know. They basically have released submarines at this point, I think. They just can't bear the thought of there being a single day without a submarine in World of Warships anymore, so they keep them in there. I don't know.
I do sometimes wonder, what kind of data they really care about. I mean, obviously we know that they care about things like how played the ship is, or the ship class is. But at the same time, do they have some kind of data that says something like, if we had submarines for 2 weeks, but then remove them for like a month, and then we, change them and balance them, and then reintroduce them, do they know something that this decreases the amount of interest people have in subs, or why would they keep doing the obsolete testing?
I mean, the official reason is because they can still collect data. I'm not sure on what. I mean, technically there is, for example, anti-submarine warfare, which you could say, we will see how counterplay to sub works. But if you fundamentally change subs, right, they change how spotting works with subs, right? So they will change how subs position. And that means it will change how effective certain range of anti-submarine warfare is. So even that data they collect, it's basically tied into the changes they make. So anything they do is basically pointless right now. So I'm not sure if they are so desperate that they hope that they can make any sort of crumb of the data useful because they have no idea what they are doing, and it's an act of desperation. Or if maybe they are afraid that if they temporarily remove submarines again and they see an upsurge in players that they actually have data that people don't want submarines, and that wouldn't look good. So it could be that they are just afraid that if they temporarily remove submarines again, that it would actually show that the players don't like them.
I suppose that's true. I actually liked submarines, though. I liked playing them, and I liked actually playing against them. But when I say that, it does come with a massive caveat. It's very
minority. I just want to say
it's the massive caveat, at least when playing against them, is that they're like old carriers, where you don't run into them every game. It's only every third game or second game or something like that. Maybe this has changed. I haven't played too much very recently. But when I did play, I didn't run into them that often. And then when they were in the match, because the submarines are more localized, like the old carriers were, there's a good chance the submarines are actually attacking somebody else for the entire game. And effectively, I don't interact with the submarines in any way other than maybe dropping some planes on them. And because of that, I wasn't really bothered by subs all that much. I think maybe this would change if I played like 2,000 extra games or something, but it's so far they're rare enough that it hasn't really bothered me when playing against them. So even if I die like to random BS, I'm like, well, fine, it's not gonna happen again next game.
I mean, you're right, they are very localized in that sense. It's also that a lot of people don't know how to properly play them yet, or because they are so new. So there is a good chance that any sub you run into is not going to be a big threat, not because of the ship class, but because they don't actually have figured out how to go forward or backward yet. But they can majorly ruin your game, and that just they're just a bunch of bullshit right now. And even if you only rarely encounter it, I think it's just those rare encounters are going to increase your frustration, especially if it happens a few times in a row. So,
kind of came to the same conclusion of A-Town in terms of it being a bit like old carriers, because it's a weirdly polar experience. There are a lot of games playing subs when you can end up not really being able to do much of anything. You run around and you try and spot, and maybe you get to try and cap, and you try and drop torps, but none of it really sticks. And it's kind of like playing a pure torpedo destroyer turned up to 11, in that some games all your torpedoes just do nothing. But those occasions when you do get to pick on someone, it's like the old style RTS carriers when someone's just sending their planes against one target over and over and over. Because with the homing torps, you're just constantly, and the quick reload of the subs, you're just able to harass one particular target quite effectively, and it kind of forces them to do to just drop everything else that they're doing, and they just have to then try and be as evasive as they can, which is obviously a lot harder when there's homing torpedoes in the equation. I mean, there are ways to dodge torps, but if they can home in on you, it definitely makes life a bit harder. So, the times when I have gotten to do that when I've been playing subs, I always kind of feel bad, because it's like I'm picking on this one person in particular, and they usually let me know that they're not happy in the chat.
I kind of disagree with your characterization there, Pointy.
Okay.
You see, you say stuff like, the old carrier would strike that one target over and over and over again. I think you've forgotten how old carriers worked. The carriers would strike the target once, and that's it, because he'd be dead after that.
I mean,
there is no follow-up because there's no ship.
I'm sort of, I guess, thinking more of
a bad carrier.
I guess the destroyer experience in particular, when you would have just like the rocket planes coming after you continuously.
Oh, you meant in that sense. Okay, I meant the RTS series, but yeah, I get it. And I actually have to also agree with you, A10. When playing submarines, part of the reason why I think I liked playing them is because I realized that almost every submarine I played against was way worse than I was at it. I mean, I get this feeling normally in the game, right? But with submarines, it's particularly important because effectively the only counter to the submarine realistically is the enemy submarine. They don't have to kill each other, but they're the only reliable way of spotting it. Like, nothing else will reliably spot them. And so, if the enemy submarine just does some random stuff or comes into the middle to fight with me, I ended up winning really hard because, well, somehow I ended up just being better than them. And as a result of that, it probably felt a lot better to play the submarines because, you know, nine games out of 10, I felt like I was king of the hill. But I did actually get, even then, games like what Pointy mentioned, where you sail around, you launch torps, and literally nothing happens because you just can't hit. The enemy somehow position themselves behind islands or near islands in a way where the torpedoes just never hit. Because one of the things you can do is that if a ship is not behind an island, but the bow is pointed towards an island, and you launch homing torpedoes at the ship, and the ship accelerates, then the homing torpedoes will just turn into the island. And you can take advantage of those things. And obviously, because submarines, especially at the start, were in ranked, those players quite quickly picked it up on the kinds of tricks you could do. Not all of them, but some of them did. And if you ended up against a team where, you know, you had 5 players that all realized these things, it did feel like I couldn't do anything. And at the same time, in other games where the players clearly didn't know what they were supposed to do against the submarine, it was just a complete slaughter.
Though I have to say, like, for some things you can do to counter submarines, there are then somewhat counters to that. Like, for example, we've probably all experienced the easiest way to dodge homing torpedoes is to be in a battleship, right? If you see the ping, assuming you can freely maneuver and you don't show broadside to anyone, right? You see where the ping is coming from and you go to a slight angle to the ping, right? So the homing torpedoes are going to aim in front of your nose because, you know, they try to intercept you. So as soon as you see them, you just slow down and turn. The torps no longer track because at 2 kilometers or so they stop tracking and they will harmlessly pass by your nose. But the problem is if the sub only like sends 2 torps that way and then waits a bit and sends 2 torps and waits a bit 2 torps because of the first initial turn, you're now turning your nose more towards the second launch and you're slowing down, which means second dodge is going to be that much more worse. And the third dodge is probably impossible because at the last point you're just basically nose into the torps and nose in you can't dodge. Also, you need to slow down with each dodge, which makes the next target like a lot easier. And with the slow reload of torps, like I had this in the tier 10 game and sub was just sending like 2 torps, 2 torps, 2 torps in a very short interval. And you can't keep up the dodge, right? You can dodge at first, but each dodge makes it easier to hit. And obviously the hit isn't going to sink you because you only get 2 torp hits because they are so small values. But it's nothing you can't keep up the dodge and you can't purge the ping because, well, the damage con is too long. So after the first ping purge, you'll ping you again, you'll get citadels and you're dead right there. There is nothing you can do.
I actually don't mind that kind of interaction, but that's because I think the main target for submarines should be battleships. Like, I think that should more or less work this way, where the submarine, if they catch the battleship in a good position for the submarine, they should effectively be able to, I don't know, if not necessarily sink the battleship, at least damage them very, very heavily. The problem is that if the battleship is caught in such a position, the way you would think is, oh, well, this is a perfect opportunity. Now the battleship's destroyer will now come up to the submarine, dump some depth charges on it, and save her. But that's not what happens. And we can't actually blame players for this, especially the destroyer players, for not doing this, because the destroyers get screwed by the submarine way, way, way harder than any other class.
True.
At least right now. The ping, the homing ping on destroyers is ridiculous. It's incredibly hard to dodge the homing torpedoes when they're homing in. And when I say incredibly hard, I'm not entirely certain if you can always dodge them, like if it's even possible. It's that there are certainly situations where you can, but I don't know if it's reliably doable. And obviously, any kind of damage to a destroyer is pretty bad.
They've announced that they are changing the distance where they home, so basically they won't home as close. So that's already an announced change, because I guess Wargaming has realized.
So, just to put into perspective, like what kind of distance we're talking about. We're talking about less than a destroyer ship length for the homing distance right now.
I think it's 120 meters or so.
Yeah, so basically the torpedoes will home in on the ship until they get within 120 meters. That's for a double ping, I think. Yeah. And then they will stop homing in, and that's the time frame you have to do any kind of dodging maneuvers. The problem is that destroyers are, well, ships in this game are twice as big as the normal numbers say. So if you normally think of a destroyer as being 100 to 120 meters long, in World Warships they're about 240 meters or 200 meters. Because, the ships are scaled up. And this effectively means that the torpedo will stop homing at you so close that it's really hard to do anything about it. And I'm actually glad they're changing it. Destroyers also have a second problem with submarines, though. They're too slow. Or rather, the submarines are too fast. Because if you think about it, sure, a submarine goes 31 knots or 30 knots or something like that. And the destroyer goes like, let's say, 40 knots. 10 knots difference. It's fairly fast, right? But now think about the fact that how long does it take to make up like a 2-kilometer difference at 10 knots speed? Because that's effectively what you have to do to catch up with the submarine. And the answer is it takes a really long time. We're talking like a minute or two. And all of this time, it's possible that the destroyer gets shot at with torpedoes or even by other ships.
Yeah, like you will have a very hard time dodging if you're going straight at the sub, because the top goes straight for your nose and it's so close. So the more you close up on the sub, like the more likely you're going to die to the sub in a sense, if the spotting doesn't kill you. They, by the way, they are also nerfing the submarine spotting. Basically, if a sub is underwater, it will only proximity spot in the future. Because they've realized that it's kind of ridiculous that a sub is diving down, you can't see it, and it can see you just fine. And spot you for everyone.
Yep. I definitely agree that was really, really silly. Effectively, the only submarine kills I got with a destroyer were when the enemy submarine pushed onto our side of the map and was like effectively under our own fleets. And then, it was possible to just sail up to them and dump depth charges. But even then, even if you get on top of the submarine, it's not guaranteed you're going to sink them in the depth charges you have available. If you take the upgrade to double the amount of depth charges you have, then probably yes. But if you don't, it's not a guarantee at all. At least I've seen certainly many times where a destroyer has come on top of me. They know where I am, they drop depth charges, and because I turned differently from the destroyer, I was able to get away. And because of the way the spotting mechanics works, I dropped to the ocean floor and just left.
Yeah, that's something Wargaming says they don't want to change for some reason. I feel like if a submarine just dives really deep, nobody should be able to see it, and that will continue to be the case. But that's also like very frustrating because you can't drop depth charges faster in that sense. You set on top of the submarine, you drop the depth charges, it just dives to the floor and it goes into like any direction, right? And if it was pretty healthy, it's probably gonna sneak away unless you guess in which direction it's going.
I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but in the sense that if there's an actual game going on, that seems pretty interesting as a way of gameplay. The submarine can get away, so the submarine actually has a reason to take a risk because they know that it's possible for them to disengage. But it does get annoying when you're only fighting the submarine and nothing else anymore, because nobody sees the submarine. You roughly know where he is, but you can't do anything to him because you don't know exactly where he is. So you basically just have to sit there and wait until the submarine runs out of battery.
Yeah, and like they hide here, they fought like 7.5 minutes, and then the Germans have the consumable that extends it by 30 seconds, and that's probably gonna get ready multiple times while they go through assuming they had the full air vent diving. So you can wait for a really long time for that sub to show.
Yep.
It does. I mean, I fully agree with the comments I've read on and Reddit in the forums about it. It just placing too much of an extra burden on destroyers, or too much of an expectation on destroyers to have to go and deal with this on top of all the other stuff destroyers already do. And of course, it definitely does put an extra pressure on everybody's damage control usage. And when playing a sub, it's a really good way to get people to burn their DCP. It's just to ping them over and over, even if you aren't going to drop any torpedoes on them. It doesn't cost you anything to ping them. And so they then burn their DCP and someone else sets them on fire.
I don't think that's quite accurate, because while it's true that it doesn't cost you anything to ping them, if you have a target ping, then you launch torpedoes, they're gonna, go for that target. And this might not really seem like
you can't do it all the time. Obviously, if you're
Yes,
trying to drop
yes.
torps on somebody else and you're pinging around all over the place, that's not going to work. But if you're just transiting to a position where you want to get an angle on a group of ships, but there also happens to be some stuff that you couldn't fly right anyway because it's going to go behind an island, or I don't know. But there are certainly plenty of situations when you can just spam that ping and make people burn their DCP when they don't need to. And of course they don't know that I'm not going to drop torps on them. So yeah.
Yep. I definitely agree with what you're saying. I had the same idea. I went into a game. I was like, oh, this is such a great position. I can see so many. Let's ping everyone a little bit just to screw with their heads. And then I was like, cool, okay, now that we're done with that, let's go launch torps at that target that I really want to launch. Let's launch the torps and then ping. And then I'm like, wait, my torpedoes are turning. No, don't go into that island. Oh god, they ran into the island. Because when I pinged the other people, I didn't wait until the ping actually ran out properly. So I am acutely aware.
If you're paying attention to the timings, and if you spread your pings around, you can keep people on edge, and they don't know necessarily which of them is going to be fired at. So yeah.
Yep.
Can play these games with subs that there's not really any counter to.
But I kind of like that submarines allow you to do things that weren't possible before. Like, one of the things that I really like is the fact that you can curve torps around islands. In a way where you launch the torpedoes without any pings, or maybe there is a ping on a different ship. And then if you time a ping correctly on another ship, you can make the torpedoes turn and reach places that regular torps can't. And I think this is really interesting, or changes the game, because when I think of playing World of Warships, when I am in a position where I know that there's no ship that has direct line of torpedoes on me because there's an island in the way or something like that, even if I'm not necessarily entirely behind an island, I'll know that they are at a specific angle and their torpedoes could never reach me from there. Submarine torpedoes aren't like that. So it does make me worry a little more about which places are exactly safe. And this is something that I think is kind of cool for the game. I would have liked curving torpedoes in the past, for example. And I don't mean like homing torpedoes. I just mean that instead of a Shimakuza torpedo going directly straight, it's possible for you to launch them so that they turn a little bit, and by 15 kilometers, they're like 3 kilometers to the right instead of directly straight ahead. I would have liked such things even in the past for that exact same reason, so that ships can't just sit in a specific place and feel that they are entirely safe because there's no direct torpedo line from where the enemies are. And submarines break that, which is something I think is kind of cool. it also means that it's possible for submarines to have a really high skill ceiling, which I don't think anyone has reached. And this is something that makes me find submarine gameplay fun. There's lots of things to still do that I am just not good enough yet for.
It's definitely a bit Wild West in terms of like people still finding out how to use these things, but even just from my limited experience playing with them, it still feels like the BS quotient of subs is just much too high.
Yeah, I mean, there is one thing about like curving around an island. There is another about a homing top that you can't dodge. That's gonna citadel you and possibly one-shot you because you're in a cruiser, and there was just nothing you could do about it. And I also feel like the biggest issue that I have with a lot of those things is that it seems like there is like no counterplay, right? If you're hunted by Shimakaze, if you move unpredictably, you might throw off his launch. You might be able to dodge basically by just moving in a way that he doesn't predict, or if you realize where he's from, angling the right way and so on. And none of this works against the sub, right? In a sub, the ball is like with the old carriers, the ball is way more in the sub's corner, right? The sub skill decides what's going to happen, not your skill in many ways, right? If you find a good sub player, it's like your options are very limited, and you're on the mercy of the sub. And I don't really like that at all. Because I know that obviously, right, not every class should be equally effective against everything, but you need some level of counterplay, and you need some class basically that counter subs that there really isn't. Right now, the best counter to sub is have a sub spot the sub and then a battleship drop charges on it.
Yep.
Either that or pin them down, while you're in a sub. Or I've had this experience either doing it or being on the opposite side of it. But yeah, you pin them down and just wait for your allies to show up, basically, and depth charge them.
Yeah, the reason, like, you need battleships that pay attention to that kill this up, because for some reason battleships are the ones that are most proficient at killing subs.
And when you say that, it's not a joke. Battleships are. I actually think that if submarine or battleship players were better at it, and the submarine players, they paid more attention, I think submarine players would rage like crazy against battleships, because some of them have ridiculous cooldowns on the airstrikes. The French battleships have 35 seconds to do another airstrike.
And it's a fairly large area. It's very far away from. I mean, it depends on the tier, but I think high tier battleships can like launch about 12 kilometers or so away, and then it's a very long line, a very massive area where they drop it. So it's like as a submarine, you just need to make sure that your friendly battleship is somewhat close, and then hope they pay attention, and then you spot like an enemy sub, and then
Yep. And they can. And the main thing is that it's spammable. Like, if a submarine gets dropped like that, they have to turn sideways to basically try to sail out of it. Because even if they still take damage when that happens, they're not going to take much, much more damage. If they just keep sailing straight, they take massive damage. I sank a submarine, I think, in 3 drops from, I think... What's the new German battleship? Not
Schlieffen.
the worst Tirpitz.
The Brandenburg.
Yeah. That one, I sank a submarine in 3 drops in it, because the submarine basically sailed in a way where it just ate more of the depth charges. And now think about the fact that while the battleships at tier 10, they might have 12 kilometers on the drop start, the actual drop itself is like 4 kilometers long. And now think of a game where you have like 5 battleships that are all in range, and they all drop on you constantly. It would be a nightmare, but luckily for the submarine players, most battleships don't pay nearly enough attention to that. I think that's something that'll come with time, just like shooting into smokescreens has.
Yeah.
In the past, remember, like, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, you were playing a ranked game, and basically the ranked game was often decided by which side's destroyer smokes up in the cap zone and then gets dev struck by the enemy torpedoes. That happened constantly back then. It doesn't happen anymore. And even before that, people didn't even torpedo smoke screens, which nowadays is also kind of a crazy thing to think about. Now you think of it, okay, I smoked up here in the smoke screen, there are torpedoes coming soon. Because it happens. And I think battleships will also do that with submarines eventually. It'll just take a really long time to get there. And I don't think we can really wait that long.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit like, there are a lot of things that a lot of people have never learned, so I'm not sure how, but it will get more problematic for submarines as time moves, because battleships might realize that, you know, they should actually drop submarines and not destroyers with the depth charges.
I can definitely see the gameplay meta sort of changing around subs as people get more used to them, but I don't know if that's ever going to really... That's not going to take away the fundamental problems that they have as a class trying to fit in with all the other classes and trying to fit in with the gameplay. I mean, we've talked in... I can't even remember. It might have been the first TC episode or one of the ones with Yusrul maybe, but I'm sure we've talked at some point in the past about parasitic game design and basically systems that get shoehorned in after the fact, you know, after the main thing has been designed, and then you have these other systems that come in and get layered on top that don't really have any other purpose other than to add more stuff for the player to do, or to, you know, grind through, or to sell stuff to the player. And subs kind of, for me, really do fit that, because they clearly never designed the game as originally envisaged around submarines. In fact, for years and years they were adamant there would be no submarines. And then now that they have decided to try and shove submarines in there, it's just created many problems. I don't know how you fix that. I don't know how you make it not BS.
I think the biggest issue is that Wargaming has never approached submarines with a plan. Like, I feel like that's how they approach. They don't have plans for ship design in general. When they make a ship, they take a blueprint, they kind of transfer the blueprint into ship stats, and then somebody takes a look at it and be like, okay, maybe we'll add this and this consumable to it, and then they just test it. And then they look at their spreadsheet and they say, like, we want this average damage on we want like an average damage between A and B, we want like a survivability between A and B, right? They have certain stats, and they just tweak stats until the spreadsheet says it's okay, and then they release it, right? But things like, how is this gonna be played? How does this fit into the game? What's the playstyle gonna be like? What role does it fill in a battle? This doesn't seem to enter Wargaming's actual thought process, or at least the way they produce ships. I would be very sad if they actually think about that, because they get it wrong so often. So I generally believe they don't actually think about this, right? For them, ship is ship, right? And they just need the spreadsheet data to be on the right place, and then they throw it out, and somebody will actually find a way to use it or whatever. And that's why there are so many, like, I think, lackluster ships there, or ships that then just fade into obscurity. I mean, there are so many premiums that get released, and you see them like maybe a week after release, and then you never see them again because nobody's interested in them, nobody plays them. There's no purpose for them, there is no sense, there's no fun in playing them, because all of those things is something that Wargaming never considers. And that's the approach also with submarines, right? They've just taken a submarine and said, like, okay, it needs to be able to dive, it needs to be able to shoot its weapons, and then we just fit it in on the spreadsheet, right? They never considered, wait, do we want them to, who do we want to counter them? How is that going to work? How is spotting going to work? How is the team play going to work around them, right? How can they fit into the game that we have? They'd be like, well, I mean, somebody's gonna figure something out. And now we are, 2-3 years later, and they haven't figured it out yet. Nobody else has. So they are just, you know, they've decided, oh, screw it, we just throw that bullshit into random battles. And it didn't work. Then they said, okay, now we're gonna change everything. And they keep them in random battles despite that. But they have now a survey up, which is a weird, as I mentioned earlier, I think, a weird timing, because they've already announced the changes. They haven't even tested the changes. Now they make a survey about old submarines. which means they can't, like, how is this gonna work, right? You need to first test them, then make a survey, and then make your changes, right? Like, I'm not sure what's the point of the surveys, but I can only encourage everyone, link to all the surveys are on Reddit, like it's a sticky thread. And I feel like it might be fun actually to look at this. I've already sent up mine, so I won't send that in, but we can take a look at this together. And
I did want to mention while we're on subs and balance, just before we move on to the surveys, it amused me no end that the one thing that this could have been popular for is going after carriers, but of course carriers have got that very, very short damage control, that automatically cycles. So trying to get homing torps on carriers is really hard unless you're basically point blank range. So
just to clarify that further. So if a submarine wants to do the most damage with the torpedoes, and it's a massive difference, they have to get 2 pings on a target. Then torpedoes can citadel. And they can do that against carriers. The problem is that damage control party wipes out the pings from submarines. And on aircraft carriers, damage control party is automatic. The moment anything breaks that damage control party can fix, the CV uses it automatically. Obviously, this would be a weakness if CVs had a normal damage control party. But worry not. CVs have a special damage control party that lasts for 60 seconds. So effectively, if you're a submarine and you want to torpedo a CV, you ping them, they become immune to pings for the next 1 minute. Obviously, the CV will notice that you did that to them because they'll see that their damage control party is active. And they'll probably leave, but then you have to shadow them for a minute and then land 2 pings and torp them. And this will deal massive damage, but it's not even necessarily going to kill them. It's pretty damn frustrating, and it's really annoying that CVs are the ship class that are probably the worst possible target for submarines.
Yeah, you think it'll be like, destroyers or other subs, or no, carriers. Of course, it's carriers.
But I do want to argue a little against what Atam said earlier. I do think wargaming does take these things into account. How would it fit into the game, etc.? Because if you just randomly add stuff, the game is actually relatively balanced. I know lots of people are going to say, oh, this isn't balanced, etc., but it is relatively balanced. Because it's really, really, really difficult to figure out whether a game is actually balanced. So they do a decent enough job in the sense that the game is playable. We don't have like release Xin Zhao, like League of Legends had, for example, where that character just went and 1v5'd everyone. That stuff happens to like every game company there is. And at the same time, there are also games like StarCraft Brood War, which is an RTS that's played professionally. Right now, it's played professionally. The last balance patch in that game was 20 years ago. Obviously, the game wasn't perfectly balanced back then. Obviously, it isn't perfectly balanced right now. And the meta has kept changing because people learn to play, etc. And the same thing would happen in any game, whether you really balanced it or not. It's just that people don't really care nearly as much about real balance in World of Warships. They care about fun and how fun it is to play against something. And carriers and submarines are kind of on the bad end of that scale. Because it ends up being really frustrating to play against them, especially for players who don't really know what the enemy can do. Because they are different.
I mean, I agree on the part that World of Warships is playable and that balancing could be worse, but it's not great. In my opinion, Warships is not great at balancing, but every ship in the game is sort of playable. There isn't a ship where like, oh my god, if I play this ship, there is nothing I can do, right? It's better in that regard with World of Tanks, because World of Tanks has just very high tier differences. So if you're low tier, there are certain situations where you're just really screwed. I think that happens less in Warships. But I'd also say that sometimes you could, like, for example, if you took the Z-41 and made it a tier 6 ship, it would be perfectly fine. I feel like that the balancing is not great in Warships, but it's most certainly playable, because in the end of the day, there is enough skill and RNG in it to make out for, like, to compensate a bit for those things. Now, interclass balancing is not so good, because carriers are way too influential and so on. But what I mostly meant with my earlier statement is wargaming doesn't go like we will design this as a brawling ship. And for a brawling ship, we need, like, it needs to be very durable to get close. It needs to be like, they don't have a concept for a ship that makes sense. They don't be like, we designed this ship for this purpose, right? They'd be like, this is a ship. It will have this part that is good for brawling, this part this is good for sniping, and this part that we just found in the garage and put on and we don't know what it does. And we're going to balance it according to a spreadsheet, and maybe nobody wants to play it because the whole thing is just a chimera that is in constant pain and makes no sense. And you know, they don't have a plan, a concept for what a ship should do. They just balance according to a spreadsheet, and that means that the game is playable because the spreadsheet is not spot on, but it's not so much off that it creates an unplayable experience.
I actually really agree with you on that one. And I think this is kind of a fundamental problem for World of Warships, though, in that I know it's an arcade game, but it is also a historical arcade game. You know, your Yamato does have 460mm caliber guns, or 46cm guns. They fire roughly 2 shots a minute, like they would have done regularly. There are these kinds of limits on it. This is why, for example, I've wanted a so-called sci-fi ships game for a long time. When I say sci-fi here, I don't mean spaceships. I mean just warships, but like they have like sci-fi abilities, like what's the anime Arpeggio of Blue Steel, where they did some crazy stuff. Because I think there's a lot of mechanics that just you can't have in a game like World of Warships, just because it wouldn't make sense. One of these would be somehow being able to really quickly change from one side of the map to the other side in certain situations. Kind of like a town portal or warp jump or whatever, right? Which would make sense in sci-fi, but in even at least a semi-arcade game that has like historical ships would make absolutely no sense. And I think that's kind of part of the reason why their hands are tied a little bit. Because as I understand it, the way they do it is they put certain statistics on like specific weapon types and what exists already, right? And because real life, these weapon types are often shared across ships. You know, there's already, because the weapon type already exists in the game, they basically share stats, or the stats are really, really close to each other. So, like, for example, an Akizuki has main guns, right, that have divided by 4 HE pen. Well, if you put the same turrets onto a battleship as secondaries, they're going to have the same stats. And this, I think, ties their hands a little bit because they decided to do that. And I do agree that this is a limiting factor for them, and what they probably don't really consider on when designing things. But just as an anecdote on what kind of balance looks like in other games, just recently there's a new game called Age of Empires 4 that released by Microsoft. In that game, it's an RTS. It's an RTS.
Familiar.
And in this game, Mongols can pack their town center, which is like the main command building, and can move it around. And basically at the start of the game, they can almost immediately get an upgrade that makes the town center basically the fastest unit in the game. As in, you pack up like a building into like a cart, and this cart outruns cavalry. And then you can drive up to the enemy's town center, unpack your town center there, and then the arrows will basically deny the enemy mining time. And effectively, this is almost an uncounterable strategy. Even if you blind counter it, you're still mostly going to lose to it. And this is a game released by Microsoft. And that's a released game now. This is, this is the kind of balancing stuff you can see in other games too. So, in a sense, I think it feels as though every single games community thinks that their games developers are uniquely incompetent. Like every game I play, everyone's always like, wow, the developers are high or something. They just can't balance anything. And I think World of Warships is maybe squarely in the middle, or maybe slightly towards the slightly worse side. But it's not really as bad as sometimes it feels from the community.
Yeah, I'd give Warships, I think, a 4 out of 10 in balancing, slightly below average.
Yeah, just to reiterate though here, 4 out of 10 here means slightly below average. It's not the movie guide where if you put 7 out of 10, then it's a garbage movie.
Yeah, we are using a linear statistic. So back to that submarine survey there. What I really like is that the first question they put in the survey is, did you participate in battles with the inclusion of submarines? And the answers are yes, no, I'm not sure. So World of Warships, our wargaming, is thinking that their player base is not capable of identifying submarines. So there's the I'm not sure option. Just in case if you weren't, I mean, considering how many people use anti-submarine warfare against other ships, I guess it's a valid question.
Maybe they just didn't realize they were playing against submarines. Because submarines are hidden, right? But actually, that question is most likely, like, I'm guessing these surveys are made by people who, like, are professional surveyors. Like, people who make surveys for a living, more or less. And these are the types of questions you have to weed out, like, random answers. Because basically any survey you have, it could ask the stupidest thing in the world, and there would always be some people who pick the stupid option just because it's a survey and people pick randomly. And I think this is one thing that tries to filter them out.
Yeah, it might be true. So afterwards they ask, did you like participating in battles with submarines?
I liked some things and disliked others. I didn't like it, and I'm not sure.
I mean, that's actually that's one of the few good questions I think in the survey, because that's something that you really want to know is, right? Did people enjoy it? And that is something that wargaming tends to ignore way too much, right? They don't care if people actually like the game.
And then,
sorry.
If you pick a follow-up and select liked, didn't like, or liked some things and others, it asks, what did you like about participating in battles with the inclusion of submarines? Wow, English is hard. True. And what did you not like about it?
Yeah, that's actually good, right? Because that is a way too broad question, so you need a follow-up and you need to give them the opportunity to actually write something. I'm not sure if anyone is ever going to read what you write, but that's so far, that's very good. That's a good question, and that's a good way how they solved it. And I hope people give them a lot of detailed feedback on this. And then they basically ask you what ship types you played, which I think this is like the follow-up questions are then about those ship types, right? Like they are asking how interesting is it? Another good question, because once again, you want to know, do people enjoy this or not?
To specify, they ask how interesting it was to play submarines, and then, the other stuff, I guess, in the next pages. Like, specifically, how interesting was it to play submarines, not necessarily interesting how to play submarines against submarines.
There is more on that as a follow-up. And then they are how easy it is to figure out how to play submarines. Once again, something that wargaming tends to ignore a lot of the time because they are too lazy to make any tutorials for anything. So once again, I think a very important question. And then they ask which submarines you played. And then they basically, I think, follow-up was... Let's see. Then they ask specifically about the different submarines, if you did like them or not. And then you can give comments on the individual submarines. I mean, personally, I only played the German ones, I have to admit.
I did find the Tier 10 German without the rear tubes a bit, like that was a bit constraining, but it did mean sometimes you could pump out more of your forward torps.
I mean, it really screws you in a sub versus sub battle, or can really screw
Yeah.
in a sub versus sub battle. At other times, I feel like it's not that big of a deal because you can position in a way that's, further away. You just dump all your fish anyway. And they can't see you because you dive.
From my experience, the American ability of quick diving was... I'm not sure if I ever actually used it on purpose. Because, I mean, okay, there were, of course, a few opportunities where I was like, I'm going to press this button as I, dive faster. But realistically, German submarines dive just fast enough that it didn't really matter, I think. It was more that the difference between the two submarine types was more that the German ones, I liked them less before the changes in the latest patch, when they had less range than the Americans. But once that was changed, I think I like the German ones more than the American ones. But they feel more or less equally competent. Like, I wouldn't really say that there's a massive balance issue with submarines, themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it never felt like, oh, we have a Salmon, they have a U-190, clearly we're in the better position, or the other way around.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd go along with that.
Yeah, I mean, at this time, especially in the submarine life cycle, the player matters a lot more than the ship.
Even then, I mean, I mean that from my personal perspective. Like, if I'm in a Beilao or a U-2501, I feel that I can do the things I want to do about equally as well. It certainly, and there's definitely differences between them. Like Pointy mentioned, the fact that the U-2501 has only forward launching torpedoes, whereas the Beilao has forward and rear facing torps, it makes a big difference. But at the same time, it didn't really feel like... It didn't feel like I was in a Hayate versus, Marceau or something.
Yeah, and then they go on about evaluating the efficiency of submarines compared to other ship types, right? Not submarines compared with other submarines. So that's a very loaded question, and I wish they had given their this is a question where I feel like you'd need something where you can write down, because what does it mean more efficient than another ship? As a submarine, you are very efficient in a way at dealing damage, but on the same time, you're probably not going to do that much camping, in my experience.
Especially not if this carrier's about.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird thing, because as a submarine, you're very vulnerable. If you're spotted and you're in range of battleships and they pay attention, then you're dead, right? Basically, you sail into a cap, and I've had that, right? You'd be like, okay, so I'm very sneaky, right? I can just go there and I take this cap, and if a destroyer shows up, I just dive, and the destroyer can't basically do anything anyway. But if you get spotted and there are battleships about, and then 3 battleships drop you, then you're probably just dead, right? So on the one hand, submarines are very sneaky and are very with the ability to be basically invisible to everyone. That's a very good defense. But on the other hand, if there are battleships that pay attention, you really have to be careful about where you're being spotted at. It's weird, because I feel like they don't really fit too well into a team setting. They are more about selfish damage dealers, but they're very efficient selfish damage dealers.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone could have known that this would happen. Maybe a Navy in real life could have tried to use submarines in fleet battles and then found out whether it works or not. But sadly that never happened, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
as we all know.
But I think less efficient or more efficient is just meant as like how powerful it feels compared to other ships. And I actually agree that it's a loaded question, but in a slightly different way. Well, is the U-2501 or the Beilao more efficient than compared to other ships of the same tier? Well, obviously no, right? Because I mean that's the same tier as the Nakimov or the or the FDR. I mean, of course they're less efficient.
Yeah,
But
okay,
not by
okay.
much.
If you compare, that's also a problem, right? Because the ship classes aren't equally efficient themselves. So you'd have to place you'd have to ask how efficient are submarines compared to carriers, compared to cruisers, which then again is also another question because not all cruisers are the same, right? Could be a radar one or not. There's the destroyers, some are more cap contesters and some are more like just gunboats. It's like the problem is that the wargaming has made a somewhat complex game and they're asking very like questions so simplified that they make no more sense. Like I feel like no matter what I click here, they will not. I can't get like my meaning across in this survey because no matter what I click, and I probably not interpreting it in the way that I mean it, right?
I mean,
now,
at best, we can hope that it counts for something, even if it is flawed, but we'll see.
I read the next question.
Yeah, how interesting was it for you to counter submarines?
Not how easy or hard, how interesting was it to counter submarines? But actually, that's a really good question. Because destroyer gameplay against submarines, to counter them, is really shit. Like, it's not interesting at all, because you're basically sailing for a minute or two away from where you were battling normally, to then possibly kill the submarine, and then sail 1 or 2 minutes back into battle again. And that's a really uninteresting type of gameplay.
And certainly at the moment, it's absolutely not worth taking the risk. You kind of have to wait for the subs to come to you, because unless you've got a clear enough area to advance into, of course, if you're going for the sub is going to spot you, and therefore their allies can shoot at you. And I've seen this a couple of times of destroyers trying to go for subs and just getting sunk and focused and sunk in the process. So it almost needs to be that you have to, like, the sub has to get caught out of position and unable to run away, and be at the point where the destroyer can go and tackle them and be close enough to their allies that they're not going to be worried about being overextended and exposed and just picked off by the enemy team. So it's really like there's no scope for kind of destroyers going off and becoming some kind of independent sub-hunting force. Like the game just doesn't support that at all.
Yeah, imagine if we had like a gameplay mode with convoys and stuff.
Yeah, imagine that. And in my experience, it really did come down to which was the better team, regardless of what sub was on it or not. Because the subs themselves, I don't feel like, for the most part, they have a huge impact on actual gameplay. It's more that they have a huge impact on
frustration.
On, like, say, 2 or 3 members of the opposing team, the ones that they are specifically focusing on. And so if your team is rubbish and you're in a submarine, there's not a lot you can do about it. Like, it's probably the weakest class in terms of actually being able to do something to counter or to shore up a team that's not doing very well. Whereas if your team is doing well enough that they're pushing forwards and creating spaces for you, then subs can suddenly become really quite powerful. But you're not going to be able to shore up a collapsing flank in a submarine in the same way that you could with a destroyer, for example.
Yeah, I feel like carry potential wise they're very low. I'd say like pure damage dealing cruisers about on par with that, because it's like, as a submarine, basically your mostly your contribution is going to be damage. I mean, you have some cap potential, I guess, but you probably aren't going for the caps early on, or depending on the situation, and you're more like trying to flank and get good torpedoes into some enemies, and you do some damage to them. But like as a destroyer, you can provide a lot more team play with spotting, capping, how you position yourself, or smoking like allies. As a cruiser, if you're like a radar cruiser, that can have a huge impact on just, hunting down enemy destroyers, taking objectives and such. As a battleship, you can sort of lead a charge and basically make a game deciding push or so on a flank. It's just like cruisers that are mostly focusing on long range. The impact, in my experience, is also pretty low, about like the same as a submarine, I guess, because submarines are in the end of the day mostly just damage dealers, right? Their contribution is they take out maybe 1 or 2 ships or so and annoy a bunch of them, but there is no much team interaction.
I'm not entirely certain I agree entirely, because I say multiple maybes there, because I agree with you overall. It's not that the submarine cannot really dictate the pace of the battle. But if a submarine somehow ends up being placed well, and usually that's not intentional, it just happens by accident due to fleet movements. If a submarine ends up being placed well, they can give an absolutely enormous advantage to one team. Like, for example, let's say you have a map that's basically there are 3 cap zones. Each team takes 1 cap zone each, and then they go, sail towards the middle to fight over there. If one team has a submarine that's basically on a path that intersects with the enemy fleet's movement, they can wreak havoc. They can just make it so that the fleet basically doesn't get to the middle cap anymore properly. Just by being there. And I think that kind of stuff can make a big difference. But you're right. Most of the time, the submarine impact isn't probably... It's not something where you feel, at least, that you're being super impactful.
I mean, I consider the point. It's also like if they get into the right position, their spotting can be pretty brutal, just like carrier spotting, right? If you can keep those cruisers behind islands spotted, so that they can't like fire from stealth anymore or stuff like that, that can really screw with teams. And I guess that's a bit of a team thing, but it's oftentimes... It's not something, as you said, I feel like it feels like it's not something that's often happening planned. And what I also have experienced is, while we're here, like how interesting is it to counter submarines, is that the thing about a submarine getting spotted, unless you have your own submarine go there with like its submarine detection thing, is that if a submarine has enough like battery left and it just dives, you basically, like we've had situations where basically we spot the submarine behind us, and then 3 ships converge on the submarine to hunt it down. But it's not a battleship, so we can't drop it from range basically, because cruisers for some reason have very shitty depth charge planes. So basically, or even worse, some cruisers don't have planes. They have to drop them from the rear, which again makes it very bad. So I've had situations like we spot the sub behind us some way, and then people converge on it, and the sub just dives. And then you just sit there and be like, okay, this sub might resurface in 5 minutes, right? You can't afford to have... So everybody converges on where the sub is, then it dives, nobody sees it anymore, and everybody goes back to what they were doing, right? We spent a minute trying to hunt the sub, we realized we can't, so we all just go away again. And then the sub surfaces again and does its thing, because, there is no way to find it. There is no way to damage it if you can't find it. And you can't really afford to just wait 5 minutes until it maybe surfaces or not.
I completely agree. But I would say that in terms of like how interesting was it to counter, for the cruisers and battleships with planes, I think it was quite interesting. Not because the mechanic of trying to airdrop the submarines is particularly interesting, but it's an additional thing to do while you're doing all the other stuff. And that I don't think those ships are meant to like go after the submarine, but rather they're just supposed to do whatever they were normally already doing. And then if a submarine pops up, they basically flick over there, drop a plane, and then flick back to whatever they were doing. And that can add, if you're in a Des Moines and you'd have to do something like that, you'd have to give something up, or you'd have to be extremely quick at aiming the planes. And I think that makes it interesting because it gives more stuff to do, particularly on the battleships.
I mean, and rewards map awareness, which is generally something that is a lot lacking. But that, you should always have good map awareness. And in that sense, yeah, if you have planes with sufficient range or so, then it feels like okay. If you have to drop the depth charges from the back, it's just...
I don't consider that to be a counter.
Yeah, it's okay that they ask how interesting it is, but they should have also asked how effective.
That's true. Speaking of the ships dropping depth charges from the back, the first time I played submarines at tier 10, at the time, I realized that I could just surface really close to the destroyer and just torp them right, through that.
Yeah.
Just as they approach me, and if I time it correctly, I can just land torps into them and kill them. So I went and tried to do that against a what's it called? What's the Swedish destroyer? Yes. And then I found out that not all ships have a depth charge launchers at the back. Some have them at the front.
Yeah.
And I promptly died against them. I feel like the front launchers on those they basically only exist just to stop the submarine from YOLOing you. Because I don't see when you'd use these launchers. Because I think the launchers, not only would they have to launch in a wider area, and I don't mean that the current amount of bombs needs to be in a wider area, I mean that they should launch an extra set of bombs on each side, so the area would be wider. And they should also launch, all ships should launch, to the front of the ship and to the rear of the ship. So effectively a bigger blanket. Because right now the area that the ship covers with ship-launched depth charges, while they drop a lot of them quickly, it's in such a narrow area that I don't think they're very effective, and as a result, it's not interesting at all. And aircraft carrier counter to submarines is...
hope you catch them on the surface and they can't dive?
I don't, that's obviously never going to happen. The only real counter I can think of from a CV's point of view is the fact that you can spot submarines even if they're dived until they go to maximum depth. Like they're at operating depth, you can spot submarines. So a submarine is at 40 meters underwater, and somehow you can spot them if you fly your plane over them, which is a little silly. But I mean, it's silly in the sense that if that were the case, you would think that other stuff would spot submarines more easily too. The planes would basically be the last thing that should get this kind of a spotting thing on them.
Yeah, I mean, they also ask how easy is it to spot submarines. Obviously, they don't give you a choice, and they give you a field where you can add your own opinions, but they don't allow you to pick based on which class you were using or things like that. But I guess, you can feel it.
I do want to say, though, that submarines countering submarines was the most interesting of the submarine interactions. Because it mostly just ended up being roughly a 1v1. Even if there were depth charges dropped and stuff, both sides were usually peppered equally. So that felt the most interesting to me out of the submarine interactions. Because there's, you play with your depth, and when you launch the torps, when you use damage control party, when you try to run away, when you try to show your side, that stuff was really interesting. But that's mostly because it ended up being roughly a 1v1.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's subjective. I didn't find submarine combat that interesting. The torps home, once again, incredibly close if you're in a sub versus sub, so if they get a double ping off and you don't purge it, you're going to eat them. So it's more I guess, playing with the depth and then hoping that the other one doesn't have its consumable that spots you, while you maybe can spot it or something like that. And oftentimes, or at least in my experience, oftentimes the battles weren't really just one-on-ones, because You just spot each other, and every battleship in the vicinity just carpet bombs the area. And you just hope that your battleships are more competent than the enemy. Then again, I don't think I ever had a sub versus sub 1v1 in a like remote area where nobody interfered. But then again, maybe I haven't played subs enough.
Okay, most of my sub-on-sub interactions have either been chasing down an enemy sub that's near our ships and keeping it spotted to get depth charged, or else having that exact same thing happen to me. So yeah, those sort of lone sub versus sub interactions are, in my experience, not that frequent. I mean, they're probably one of the more engaging parts of playing submarines.
Basically, they remind me of space battles in other games. Particularly because in other games, for some reason, when a spaceship stops accelerating, they stop. Which makes absolutely no sense, and it really should be submarine battles rather than space battles. And
True.
submarines fighting submarines reminded me of that.
Honestly, I mean, the thing is that submarine versus submarine is basically has nothing to do with World of Warships in general, right? It's that completely, if you actually have just two submarines fighting, it's a completely contained, entirely different game that works entirely different as World of Warships, where you have sort of a cat and mouse thing going on, where you have to be worried that does it have front or rear launches? You need to keep enough distance, maybe that there is a chance for the torps to maybe be dodged. You have to watch your damage count, but oftentimes it's just like, whoever gets the first homing torps off that can't be ping perched wins. It's a bit weird.
Also, I don't really find that this happens frequently, where like you actually kill them with torps. I mean, it happens, but usually you might hit a torpedo and then the fight just kind of stops or something. Or you just constantly miss and decide to go your separate ways at one point. But if anybody is listening, here's my number one recommendation to submarine versus submarine fights. Equip a ramming flag. Genuinely. Because if the enemy doesn't have a ramming flag, you can just ram them. They can't, because it's almost entirely possible to dodge torpedoes enough to get close to ram them if the enemy just doesn't start running quickly. And if they don't have a ramming flag, they're dead.
I will say
there's nothing they can do.
The one time a ramming did happen between me and another sub. Neither of us had the flag, so it was all just mutual annihilation. But yeah, I'm going to have to do that. Put ramming flags on my subs.
Although I have to say, though, that ramming underwater works a bit weird. I think because there's the diving and submerging part, where you go up and down, that changes the collision speeds to slow enough that they don't instantly kill every time. So ramming can be a bit weird in it. I mean, like I have rammed the submarine and we both sailed away from it.
I mean, let's be honest, ramming in this game is often very weird and has been on multiple match cycles been buggy.
It's almost as if this was a mechanic, a thing that had been introduced that that's meshing with systems that it was never intended for, kind of thing. I've probably put that in an awkward way, but you kind of know what I mean, right?
True, but I mean, they had in the past, I think, wasn't there like one time this bug that when you equipped like a speed flag or something on your ship, then rams did no longer work, where you could like full speed ram something and then go away with it. I remember there was a bug like this, I think 8 years ago or so, which was very interesting. It was a weird flag that you wouldn't expect. Like, I think it was just put a speed flag on your ship and then you can't no longer ram properly. Like, they've had weird bugs with ramming, because it's probably one of those overly complicated systems for no reason. Like torpedoes.
Yep. Wait, are you saying that you want torpedoes to work like ramming?
No, torpedoes are overly complicated. It's something that I didn't know for a very long time. But somebody is like, how basically he did more damage, was I think, with a submarine than the maximum damage that a torpedo can do with his torpedoes. And he was like, how is that possible? And then I actually looked up the wiki, and then I found out that that maximum torpedo damage is not maximum torpedo damage. There is no such thing as maximum torpedo damage. Maximum torpedo damage is alpha damage divided by 3 plus splash damage.
I'm sorry, what?
The maximum torpedo damage in port is alpha damage of the torpedo divided by 3 plus splash damage, because every torpedo does alpha damage and splash damage depending on where it hits. If a torpedo hits you in the nose, it does 16.5% of your alpha damage plus the full splash damage to the nose, and then it does the splash damage to the center part. If a torpedo hits you in the center part, it does no splash damage, it does the alpha damage modified by the torpedo modification thing. And if a torpedo hits a destroyer in the midsection, it does, I think, 33% of the alpha damage or something like that.
I have played this game for 6 years now, and I did not know that. What?
Yeah, I found this out like weeks ago, right? Because somebody asked that question, and I was like, there must be some reason why this. And then I looked up the wiki, and then I found out that torpedoes, I always thought, a torpedo has a damage value it does, and that gets modified. If it hits like the belt, it gets modified by torpedo protection and such, and maybe there's a little bit of randomness in it. But you always thought like maximum torpedo damage is maximum torpedo damage, but that's absolutely not how it works. Maximum torpedo damage isn't a real number.
Wow. So basically, torpedoes really
complicated.
The torpedo damage you see is really like is like the damage that your HE shell actually does rather than what port shows you, right? So port shows that your HE shell does 9,000 damage, but when you actually shoot the target, it does 3,000 damage. So torps have just show the 3,000 instead, right?
Not really, because they show alpha damage divided by it's more complicated in that sense, because there are two damage, like each torpedo has two damage values, alpha and splash, and the relation between those two might be different depending on ship. It's not like the one is a percentage of the other or so. So some torpedoes might have more alpha and some might have more splash, and then it uses a different formula depending on where your ship gets hit. And the value in port is shown alpha divided by 3 plus splash, right? But for example, if it hits you in the center, I don't think it does splash. If I remember correctly, it only does alpha. If it's the nose, it does a percentage of the alpha plus the splash. So a lot of it depends on what relation alpha and splash has. Which you don't know.
This was the... I'm just... Okay.
Yeah,
this is a truly mind blown to me. And yet the wiki lists it.
Everything.
Why?
It's in the wiki, right? I only found this out like recently, basically. But that's how wargaming does the thing, which raises interesting question also about sub-torpedoes. How does the Citadel stuff work that ignores torpedo protection and so on? And the more you know, the more you're confused about.
Actually, I think I know why this works this way. It's because of the system where, how a ship has, Yamato has 97,200 HP. Well, it doesn't really have that HP. Well, I mean, it does, but really, if you try to kill the ship, you're dealing damage to sections of the ship that actually have more HP than the 97,200. But a section can run out of HP, and then you don't deal damage to it. And I'm guessing the torpedo alpha plus splash damage thing, it's done because of that, because of the sections and the damage.
Possibly. There is also, in the wiki, I mean, you can bring up the page if you like, there was, I think that since patch 7 something, I think torpedoes do always at least 10% of their damage or something like that. So there is, like, even if it's depleted, torpedoes can never do 0 damage.
That actually did happen in the past. Like a destroyer versus destroyer fight, and one DD eats everything just with the bow, and the last torps do no damage. Or very, very little.
Yeah, I think that has been patched down at some point. But yeah, like the torpedoes are needlessly complicated.
Also, I actually opened the wiki page and it has an interesting sentence here. On the topic of wargaming doing the things that they said they're not going to do, here's the sentence. Once the torpedo is armed, it will always explode when hitting a ship. Duds, non-explosions, or ricochets are not planned for the game. Yet.
Well, I mean, it would make playing the lower tier US submarines super fun.
Yeah, imagine if you launch a torp and there's like a, let's say, 0.5% chance that it explodes in the torpedo tube. Especially in a submarine.
Well, how about if it decided to circle round and come back after you instead?
Yeah, that would also be a possibility.
By the way, side note, I mean, once I've had this revelation because I've read the wiki, which I should have probably done years ago, Mouse mentioned that she, and I think Stansblock, they did some damage on this whole Splash and Alpha thing to figure out certain things. And I think she mentioned, don't remember which ship she mentioned, I think it was the Black, that had like a very high, I think, splash value, so it was a lot less... but basically, it was a lot more consistent no matter if you hit like the Citadel or the torpedo protection as such, because of different proportions of splash to alpha damage and how like the damage is calculated. Like torpedo protection isn't equally useful against each torpedo, basically.
I see. You know what would be really cool? If stuff like this were shown in game, instead of, I don't know, just knowing somehow magically that my Des Moines shells ricochet at 60 degrees to 67.5 degrees compared to my Iowa's 45 to 60 degrees, instead of just somehow knowing that, it would be really cool if the game had this like panel where it could show statistics what the shell could do.
Oh yeah,
Maybe they could add that, and maybe they could do that same thing for torpedoes, that they show the splash damage and the alpha damage and maybe the size of the splash damage. I mean, they show the depth thing for shells, right? For HE shells and etc. against submarines. Why couldn't they add this stuff, forever ago?
I think they just hope most people don't figure out how the game works and are happy in their delusions what they see in porn.
Yes, my ship has 98 points AA. Yours only has 81. Clearly, mine has better AA.
I mean, definitely.
Yeah, and then it turns out my ship's max AA range is 2.5 kilometers.
Can you imagine finding out that your anti-air guns don't start loaded into the game and that all your flak doesn't start shooting until the planes are actually through it? So even though you technically have flak, it realistically never fires.
Yeah.
Wargaming. Well, I mean, sorry?
Soon someone's gonna tell me that actually Yamato does fire beehive shells for AA. You just don't see it.
I still can't get over the torpedoes having the damage thing. It's blown my mind.
Yeah, I went through the same phase a few weeks ago, so I went through the whole shock, denial, and stages of grieving, and moved on.
Wow.
So where are we in this survey then? We can't be that far off the end.
Yeah, we were what level of damage was inflicted to your ships by submarine launched torpedoes? High, average, low, I'm not sure, and then you can pick for the classes. I mean,
cruisers should be extremely high.
Yeah. Like, the thing is, They also fail to specify, well, how do you take it? Do you take it as in one hit or in over the course of a battle and so on? Because, I mean, obviously, as a battleship, you have better ways to mitigate the damage, but if a sub is really hunting you, then eventually it might get you, right? Or if it's like forcing you into crossfire, because eventually maybe other ships get involved and you stop being able to turn and dodge, right? If you're in a cruiser, maybe it just pings you, they home in and you're dead, and there wasn't anything you could do. You could never spot it, you could never dodge it, and
on the cruiser, the answer is very high, regardless how you phrase it, because cruisers seem to really get screwed by subs. It's entirely possible to just one-shot a cruiser with a sub-torpedo launch, and at the same time, there's very little you can do in return.
I mean, destroyers, it gets a bit more questionable because, like, if the sub knows what it's doing, I haven't really been destroyed by subs directly that often in destroyers. I have encountered a sub or two that knew what they were doing, and basically the torps just homed in on my destroyer and there was nothing I could do and I was dead. I know that if like, basically a sub catches onto you in a destroyer, you need to like get out of there or smoke or something because there is no way you can chase it down and there's no way you can do something. The thing is, if you spot like the sub in your destroyer, then it comes down to how many battleships you have that help once again. So it's a bit weird. I haven't really been devastated that much in destroyers, but if you get into an encounter and the sub knows what it's doing, basically the answer is high because it's basically uncounterable, you are dead kind of situation.
There was a clip someone posted on Reddit not that long ago, like a couple of days ago, and it was basically they got caught out by server desync and they thought they were dodging these homing torpedoes. And it looked to them, and in their recording, like they were dodging these homing torpedoes, but in reality, they weren't. And so even though it looked like the torpedoes were sailing right past, they then exploded and died.
I've seen 2 or 3 of those, actually. And that is concerning because part of the reason why it looks this way is because of the homing ending so late, I think.
Yeah.
So... And yeah, like the torpedo just completely missed the ship, and then it was like, haha, kidding.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point because, like, the regular torpedoes, they are very easy for the client to... Well, obviously, the server does the actual calculation and your client does a prediction, basically. Your client renders what it thinks happens and the server knows what actually happens. And I'm not sure at which intervals they communicate, right? So once the client basically spots the torpedo and gets picked up, then the client basically renders what it thinks is gonna to happen. But I'm not sure how well the client like realizes when the spotting cuts off and so on. So there might be like because only the server has the real information. If they don't communicate often enough, that could possibly they could lead to desync. But I'm no expert on any of this.
It definitely is going to be like if that's something that even if it's something that only happens occasionally, if it's a it's another not nice thing for destroyer players when they're trying to deal with submarines. I'm trying to find that clip now, but yeah, if you've seen things like it, then you'll know pretty much what it was what was happening in it.
So after like asking people how much they get wrecked by subs, they ask how easy they think they are to count. I mean, those are, I guess, kind of linked. But that's definitely a good question for them to ask because it almost looks like Wargaming has realized that counterplay is a thing. And it should be a thing because their past design, they often like glossed over the fact that things should have counters. Maybe they're learning, or maybe they aren't. Who knows?
One can always hope.
Yeah, and what's very interesting is that they follow this up by asking how are your chances of minimizing damage from like destroyers, from cruisers, from battleships for each class, which is obviously a very good point because they want to compare it, right? If you feel like you don't have a counter to submarines, but you feel like you also don't have a counter to the other classes, then obviously, right, they would perform about the same level. That's what Wargaming is going for. But once again, I feel like the questions are just in a way too broad because there's so many different cruisers, battleships, destroyers. Also, how would you evaluate your chance of minimizing damage from hostile battleships in a cruiser? I mean, that depends because my cruiser, if I'm in a Des Moines, most battleships I encounter will overmatch every part of the ship except for the citadel belt, right? The deck, the nose, the upper belt, the rear, everything gets overmatched. So basically your chances of minimizing damage are in a sense zero, other than dodging. Which means a Des Moines is not the best ship for open water dodging. Or it's basically being behind an island, in which case if you have the right island, so a smoke screen, your chances of minimizing damage are pretty good. Unless a carrier shows up and then spots you behind your island, in which case they are low again.
Yeah, or you could be in a Petropavlovsk, in which case your chances of minimizing damage are extremely high, regardless what's going on in the game.
True, right? There are just so vast differences between classes and the situations that you can't actually give a representative answer. I would still generally say like you have a low chance of minimizing damage from battleships in your cruisers, because the overmatch is just often very punishing for them. But once again, it's a much more loaded question that you can't really answer that easily. And then obviously they have how do you elevate your chances of minimizing damage from hostile aircraft carriers, which is pretty easy because you just go with low everywhere. So at least one question that's pretty trivial.
I did find it interesting that they were asking how people feel about other classes as well versus other classes, not just subs. So
I mean, it's very important because you need to, if somebody feels like, for example, they can't do anything against the subs, but they feel the same way against the destroyer, then, it's not as concerning. If somebody thinks they can counter everything or they know how to play against other things, but subs are just standing out, then that's a much more concerning thing, right? From a,
I suppose, it helps calibrate the earlier part of the feedback as far as they're concerned.
I mean, you've got to see everything in context, because in the end of the day, you want submarines performing equally to existing ship types and not the submarines like vastly overperforming or underperforming compared to them.
Or, at the end of the day, maybe not even in the game at all.
I mean, they can't be overperforming or underperforming if they're not in the game.
Exactly.
True. Then they ask, do you think submarines are ready to be introduced into the game on a permanent basis in their current state as a researchable branch? It's an interesting question because they have already announced 2 weeks ago massive changes, which means asking what we think about the current subs if they are ready for the game is a bit pointless because they are already, going to be changed. I mean, which makes the entire survey pointless because they ask about an outdated product. This whole survey is a little bit about, we ask people if they like apples to figure out if they like oranges, right? That's basically the point of the survey.
Well, I mean, if you really think about it, are they ready for the game? Well, they're already in the game, aren't they?
Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're ready, right? You can have a self-driving car that on average kills one person a day, and it's not ready for the road, but you can still put it on the road, right?
I suppose that's true.
But it's an interesting analogy, but yeah.
I mean, the thing that gets me about this whole test, I've called it a limited time release, although I'm not sure about the limited time in the past, because if it was a proper test, you'd test it at least for a certain amount of time. then you'd collect the feedback on it, and then you would go make the changes, and then you'd test those changes again. But their refusal to remove the untested product that they know is faulty really doesn't make it a test. They just basically release the faulty product and they're fine with it.
I mean, that's the go-to thing in video games these days, though, isn't it? Just, it doesn't matter if it's broken or not, just release it anyway, and we'll patch it later. It's fine.
Or software in general.
Yeah. And if they basically they promised they wouldn't do this after the carriers, but they said no, this time we call it a test. We've basically released it. We made them easier to acquire than if they were actually released, because everybody gets them. Everybody can play them. There is no restriction on them. They are basically part of the main game right now. They're fully integrated into the game at this moment. But we call it a test. And even though we've completed our test, we still keep testing. So, you can't complain. They're not released. They're tests. But at least they ask you specifically, why do you think they are not ready? Well, because of all of the other stuff you said, and I'm not going to press submit here because I already submitted the survey in the past. It's, I really wonder what they're going to do with this survey. And I really wonder if there are going to be any other big changes and when they actually test the updated submarines. I mean, we now have, 2 more weeks of broken subs. And then maybe in the next patch, they will have the newer subs, and then we'll probably keep testing that for an entire patch cycle. And I wouldn't be surprised if then afterwards they call it a release. And I wouldn't be surprised if there will never be another World of Warships without subs in random battles.
Well, I mean, they're only on the even tiers right now, though, so who knows?
Yeah, I mean, sure, you can kind of battle with any right, like areas, but I feel like they will never be completely removed again, right? Like they will never pull the subs out again and be okay, we'll now apply changes and then we try again, and we will only put them back in when they're ready. They'll be yeah, I mean, sure. Right, they are right now not working and broken, and we want to change them. But let's just keep the broken stuff in there.
Yeah, I think you're right on that one, though. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that concludes that survey, and now all that remains to be done is see what Wargaming's conclusions are. Probably none.
How do we get some kind of follow-on article and it doesn't just vanish into the ether? Or that we actually get to see some of this newfangled communication with the community stuff that they're trying out.
I think that would be really cool, to see what their server results actually are.
Yeah.
I think it would be really cool if Wargaming did something like that. I also think that Wargaming in general should ask the community way more questions, especially things like, if they screw something up, for example, give the community options on what, should be done. Should we do this? Should we do that? Should we do the third thing, or maybe something else entirely? And then see what the community thinks. That way you'll have a better pulse, have a finger on the pulse, so to say.
I feel like Wargaming has very little regard for customer satisfaction in a way. It feels like they have been ignoring feedback for a while. We will all hope that they are going to change back again and take actual community feedback into consideration. But it's also, I feel like, the way they design their game or they design their ships and stuff. They don't really do much to keep people engaged in a sense. All they do is pump out more ships. But they really neglect things like game modes, things like a more visual stuff, or balancing what's already into the game, or reworking older maps, or like, things or events or something like that. There's a lot of things that you could do to keep a community engaged in the game and keep like the long-term players interested. And the interesting thing is that, rushing out all those ships doesn't really help with new people, right? If a person starts the game today, you can sell them a tier bits. You don't need to design a Brandenburg for that, right? You only need to design a Brandenburg to sell the person who already has a tier bits to sell them something new. So they design so many ships to sell to existing players, but they don't seem to care about keeping the players actually engaged, giving them interesting content, or even making interesting ships for them, right? I have a feeling that Wargaming absolutely doesn't care. If you buy a Brandenburg today and you played 5 battles and never again, Wargaming is fine with that. They don't be like, well, if we make more interesting ships, if we make stuff that people actually enjoy, then they'll come back and want more and buy more. It feels like it never really entered the thought process that maybe try to keep people engaged.
I mean, maybe this is one of those things where we can sort of sit here and shake our heads about it, but then you look at the spreadsheet and actually that's the profitable way to operate, even though it doesn't necessarily seem particularly great to any of us. I mean, there are examples out there of I recently learned about this game publisher, in air quotes, called Gamigo, that basically buys up MMOs from other companies and just hikes up the hikes up the grind, hikes up the prices on everything, and just drives them into the ground. But over the course of the 2 or 3 years before they inevitably completely kill the game, it's really profitable for them. So it's not necessarily about, is this good for the game? It's about, is this good for the spreadsheet? I mean, I think that's probably that's Wargaming's prime consideration always.
But that's what I'm wondering, right? Because they basically remove. Well, I mean, there is the steel. The only grinds left are kind of research bureau and steel sort-of-ish. Because there is no longer a ship grind, because ships are released through early access. So you basically play other stuff and you get the ships just unlocked, or throw money at them and get them unlocked. So basically, by the time a ship line is released, you're at tier 7, 8 or something. Anyway, so the actual grind, the actual thing that kind of what keeps people engaged, right? What keeps them coming back? Like, oh, there's a new ship line to grind. They kind of patched that out in a sense. The only thing that they are adding basically for the existing player is new ships, and they don't really go through great lengths to make them attractive, I feel like, many times. What we've said earlier, that basically they don't have great concepts for a ship that's designed to be fun. It's just for them, well, ship. We have a blueprint, let's just make this blueprint, let's just throw it out, right? Maybe somebody enjoys it, maybe not. I mean, they're certainly making money with what they're doing, obviously, but I feel like they could probably be a lot more efficient. I feel like they just never really sit back and question what they are doing. Could they're doing better? They never really want to look to what other games do or what other companies do, or could we be more successful? They have some sort of idea how they want to do things, and they just don't care about anything else. They just keep.
Yeah, they're quite insular in that regard. But I'll just, in regard to your previous point, I will say that I don't think every ship has to have, or every ship line has to have, universal appeal to every player. I think as long as every ship and class can hold its own and be at least somewhat enjoyable to play to at least a somewhat majority of players. I mean, sometimes you end up with ships that are just the skill ceiling is the skill floor rather is just too high. But I'm broadly on board with the idea of some ships being more challenging to play than others.
I want to question you a little bit on that one, Atem. Do you really want them to, take inspiration from other companies? Because
Not
let's
all
think
of them.
about let's think
Yeah.
about what are some of the
Multiple
biggest
ways.
gaming companies right now.
EA.
Let's see. EA, Blizzard. What was one of the most profitable games like ever released in the first year? It was Genshin Impact now, right? I read an article just the other day about it. I am not sure how much I want them to inspired by them.
I mean, the things I've been on a bit of a. I don't play MMOs at all, but like I've been on a binge watching videos about different obscure MMOs. That's how I learned about Gamigo. But yeah, like some of the monetization in those is just completely scummy, especially the ones that come out of like Korea seems to be particularly bad for like extremely grindy, extremely predatorily monetized MMOs. So there are certainly some very bad examples out there that wargaming could choose to emulate. Hell, one of the things, oh god, what's his name? Andrew Wilson, the guy that's the head of EA, who seems to now be trying to ease people. What was it he said? There was an interview he did, and it was like, oh well, you know, we know players want more things in our games, like NFTs. And I seriously don't think anybody is sat there playing their FIFA games going, yeah, you know what this needs is NFTs. But
blockchain.
That's where these big companies are going. So yeah, I don't want wargaming to follow those examples.
Yeah, true. I was thinking about companies that basically are successful by treating the player better.
Yeah.
That's right. Unfortunately, you're right that a lot of big companies are really scummy in many ways. And you're right, I think like in Korea, basically Korean MMOs are all just heavily paid to win, like truly paid to win, not what we Westerners see as pay to win. More like okay, you paid us money, you're sure you can kill 5 people by yourself without lifting a finger.
So I am from a country that's poorer than yours, especially when I was growing up. And so I ended up playing a lot of free-to-play games, mostly Korean MMORPGs. And Korean MMOs, or Korean games in general, seem to be ahead of their time in terms of like what the PC market is like. Like what Korea does seems to effectively happen later on everywhere else too. For example, the free-to-play gameplay model was something that was done in Korea a good 10 years before it really, went to the West. So, World of Warships is a free-to-play game.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like this happened a good 10 years before World of Warships was a thing in Korean MMOs already. But something that seems to be even further ahead than the Korean PC game market seems to be the mobile market. And that seems to be what's basically inspiring the Korean game market right now. Because, first of all, mobile games are extremely popular. And for some reason, players are willing to accept they're willing to accept macro-transactions on a large scale.
Yeah, one of the extremely common things is the pricing of premium currency items not at all coinciding with the denominations of the packs of those premium currencies. And so you always have to go one over to be able to buy that, bit of armor or whatever it is you want.
Effectively, what he's saying is that, let's say you want to buy an MTX like a character skin, and that costs 600 points in the game. You can buy 500 points for $5. And the next pack you can buy is 1,000 points for $10. They have to buy 1,000 points to buy the 600 point skin.
So you have 400 left
really
over.
cost. Yeah, and that's basically what they do.
And then you can't buy anything for 400, maybe only for 450. So you need to buy the next pack to get that. So you always have some currency over, and you feel like this is wasted unless you buy the next pack and spend it on something else.
Yeah,
pretty much. Yeah. So at least with wargaming and World of Warships, you can buy the exact amount of doubloons you want, or even just pay the cash from the shop.
I mean,
not
the scumminess level is open-ended, right? Wargaming is not yet playing with the major leagues, although they are. They
Yet.
have said that they've chosen that path in that direction. Although, at least we're getting odds now, which is an improvement.
Well, things could always be worse, I suppose.
Could be worse, could be raining.
What do you mean? It already rains in game. Cyclones have been a thing for a while.
Yeah, it's basically a joke that one of my viewers likes to make a lot, and it's a reference to what's it called, Young Frankenstein, an old movie. It's a joke in that movie.
Oh, yeah, that's a great film. That's a classic. I want to go watch that now.
Well, I think we've mostly covered what we wanted to talk about. Is there anything?
There was one very last thing that I just happened to catch on Reddit. That I'll see if I can find the actual post, but essentially they had been doing special regional pricing for India, and that's coming to a close, and they don't seem to have really given any particularly good thing for why. Hang on, here we go. Right, I'm going to need chat permission to post this link, aren't I? It's just maybe a mod 8 It's fine. I totally won't abuse my powers, honest. If we can post that. There we go. So, yeah, I mean, it's I presume that's a Discord post from Tucky. And yeah, apparently the regional pricing in India has actually been really cheap compared to elsewhere, but that's coming to an end.
Yeah, I have one regular viewer from India, and I knew that the stuff was very cheap for him, so he's not gonna be happy about this, I guess.
Yeah, because I mean, the average income of someone in India is going to be considerably below that of other people in the EU. But if they're going to be getting the full fat EU prices, I mean, that's not going to be a popular move. I don't know why they've done that.
I think so too. Actually, on that topic, I think EU has kind of screwed up a little bit, because EU basically has some kind of a rule about it, that you can't have some kind of price discrimination, as I understand it. So this isn't going to affect India, but I mean inside the EU.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at like the average income of Bulgaria, especially like, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, and compared it to like the average income of, I don't know, Belgium or something, and you look at it and difference is like 5 to 7 times. And they're like, wow, and they're supposed to pay the same price?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the higher end stuff that's just really priced out for people in the poorer parts of the EU, the places where the median incomes are a lot lower. And yeah, it just kind of like, it's not even necessarily Wargaming's fault in the EU in particular, just with the way it operates. But
what really rubs me the wrong way is I'm looking at your post right now, is the wording from Wargaming, right? They are like...
Yeah, it's weird. While we are satisfied with our execution and results, we've concluded that we'll be discontinuing the special pricing for players in India. There's not really any reason given for it. It's just, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore.
They're basically saying, yeah, it was a great thing that we did, and there were no downsides to it, so we will stop doing it now. Yay!
everybody's happy, right? Including the people who won't be.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like they can't even, like, usually Wargaming just has a lie prepared that's very transparent, but at least they try lying about it. Now they just given up. I mean, I've realized Wargaming is very bad at lying because their lies are usually very transparent. Maybe they've been like, look, we are very bad at lying, we just don't give a reason. We just don't. I don't know. It's I mean, they could have come out and said, look, laws in China prevent us from giving special prices in India because,
There probably aren't reasons like that here, though. They probably just realized that this wasn't making them as much money as they thought
I
it was
imagine
going
that's
to.
what
Or
it
maybe
comes
he's
down
losing
to.
them money.
Well, I mean, if they're playing on the EU server, I don't like there isn't either the EU or the Asia server. I don't know what would be better for India, but yeah, I don't see how having a larger number of people able to buy their thing is like these are pixel goods. It's not like it costs them shipping and manufacturing costs or anything like that. So I don't know.
Look, Pointy, you have to understand that the 0.0001 cents that costs for electricity to add this into the database is too expensive.
That must be it. It was the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet said that they could save that 0.01 pence. Anyway, that was the only other thing I'd spotted, so there isn't really anything else to talk about, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, we've been going for 2 hours already, so I guess it's a good time to call it a night.
All right.
Yeah, thanks, Aerroon, for joining us once again. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Yeah, can we find you elsewhere apart from, well, we've got your YouTube on screen, but I believe your stream as well?
Yes, I have an annual stream on Twitch. It's twitch.tv/Aerroon. I genuinely have been streaming very little. But that's about it. I mean, I mostly just use Discord in the official wargaming stuff and elsewhere. And I do chat about the game. Nowadays, actually, maybe equally as much as I play.
Yeah. So, thanks again, everyone, for watching. Wish you a good night, and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.